So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for, I know there are a number of people who are tuning in today on Zoom, and I'm excited to introduce our grand round speaker, Dr. Jason Karlawish. And I just have a few notes of introduction. He's a geriatrician, professor of medicine, medical ethics, and health policy, as well as neurology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's also co-director of the Penn Memory Center. His research, which we're very fortunate to learn from today, has shed light on some of the really important ethical aspects of dementia care and dementia treatment, as well as humanitarian aspects of the same. And I think, as many of you will recognize, Dr. Karlawish is also an author. He's a novelist, and most importantly, he's been an esteemed guest of the Jerry Powell podcast. So please welcome me in, or join me in welcoming Dr. Karlawish.
Yeah, after Jerry Powell, it's just downhill from there. I'm not kidding you. So Alex Smith pulls up in front of the university club, and this, I should have said it that way. I spoiled the punchline. So this SUV type car does this like 180 swing around. I'm like, who's that? And I look, and the license plate says Jerry Powell. I'm like, oh, it's Alex. I swear to God, his license plate says right. It's great to be here. Thanks a lot. When I got the invite, I'm like, absolutely, would love to come out. And it was great to come out and be here and live and in 3 dimensions, and enjoyed the meetings I've had with folks here as well, catching up and talking ideas. And it reminds us, why we're in academics. It's, these kind of relationships you build and the ideas that come from them. And in some sense, this project that I'm going to present to you is a product of that. I'll explain on a slide that'll come up, so where the relationships came out. And it is an example of a project where, as a physician, when I was initially invited to this meeting around lucidity, or paradoxical lucidity, I'm like, what? And the rest is history. So this is as much a personal story in some sense as it is a scientific story. It's a very descriptive title, truly. But I hope by the end of the talk, you start to see some of the deep clinical and ethical implications of taking lucidity seriously in persons with advanced dementia. This work comes out of a collaborative team here, whose names you see listed. I just want to call out 2 individuals in particular. Andrew Peterson is a philosopher of mind at George Mason University, Greenwell Faculty Scholar, and a dear friend and colleague. And Justin Clapp is a medical anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania, who does work in, he's a linguistic anthropologist. It's a specific discipline. And the skill set he brought to this project was really key for the gathering and the analysis of data. I think if you ask most people, to talk about dementia, they say, oh, that's a memory problem. Alzheimer's, that's a disease of memory. And, certainly that loss of that particular cognitive ability is a sort of stereotype of the disease. But, fundamentally what it is about dementia, about Alzheimer's, that is the problem, is this threat of losing your mind. And indeed, the first federal report written on Alzheimer's disease was entitled Losing a Million Minds, Confronting the Tragedy of Alzheimer's Disease and Other Dementias. And this is a line from that 1987 report from the now defunct Office of Technology Assessment. What happens to the mind when a dementing illness strikes? Families and professionals alike struggle to understand why persons with dementing illnesses act as they do, and what, if anything, can be done to modify the person's strange behaviors or support lost skills. Now, nowhere in Losing a Million Minds does the report actually define what a mind is. And yet, throughout the report, it's very clear that loss of mind and the threat of that is sort of the animating reason to sort of why the federal government in 1987 thought that this was an important problem and something that needs to be addressed. And I can't tell you how back in 1987, the problem was so under-recognized and underappreciated. From losing a million minds to losing my mind, from a statistic to an individual, this idea of dementia, of Alzheimer's, is causing you to lose your mind, I think certainly animates sort of the fundamental fear of the disease, the reason why we care about the disease. This is just one book written about the disease, where the theme of mind or mind loss or death before death, other concepts of, because fundamentally a creature that is mindless but alive would be considered, for example, a zombie. All those tropes and ideas, some quite stigmatizing, some quite frankly disgusting, occupy the way we think about this disease. And I think for legitimate reasons, because there is something that happens to the mind of a person living with dementia. So, what is a mind? I will talk more about later. But the fundamental issue here is that a mind is changed, and a mind is perceived by other people. Now, you're perceiving my mind right now because I'm engaging in a host of behaviors that are activities that represent intentions and beliefs on my part. And you're seeing me do things that give you evidence that I'm capable of formulating intentions, holding beliefs, etc. You're perceiving my mind. So you're making inferences about me based on unobservable properties of intentions, desires, goals, and beliefs based on the things that I'm doing. I assure you, I do have a mind. I'm not a robot. I'm not an avatar. And I think when you think about sort of the sophistication of a robot equipped with ChatGPT-3, you can see why mind perception is such a challenge, because we could now make an Android-type creature with ChatGPT-3 that could probably fool you, and you would think I'm talking with something with a mind. But I would argue that a ChatGPT-3 filled robot is fundamentally mindless, in part because it has no ability to experience the world. It has no ability to say what it is like to be that robot. So I would submit that, whoops, sorry, I don't think you see it, but I love how Windows pops up all kinds of special things that you could use that you don't want to use. I just close that window. Of course, in persons with dementia, mind begins to change. The person's ability to express intentions, to hold beliefs, in some way becomes changed. In addition, their ability to experience the world some way becomes changed. Losses in smell, losses in taste, changes in visual perception, changes in emotional motivation, leading to things like problems like apathy, etc. So there's no question that early on, it is a disorder of mind. Minds change. Indeed, as the disease progresses to a very advanced stage, I think many of us would see profound changes in the person's mind, in their ability to have agency, to express intentions and hold beliefs, in their ability to experience the world. And for you, and the challenge of a caregiver is, in some sense, perceiving that mind and seeing where is that mind or where is it not, particularly in advanced dementia. And for many who would witness a person with advanced dementia, they would perceive them as a person who is essentially without a mind, has lost their mind, or put another way, is no longer lucid. And what's interesting, of course, is that if you talk, many of us know who have practiced in this field, that caregivers of patients with advanced dementia, for whom a casual observer might say there's no mind there, will come back and say, well, no, there is a mind there, or sometimes there's a mind there and sometimes not. And just as another example of yet another case of this is Nora Foster. Her obituary was recently published in the New York Times. She was the wife of John Lydon. Some of you may know John Lydon, more popularly by his name Johnny Rotten, of the Sex Pistols band and subsequently Public Image Limited. His wife died of Alzheimer's recently. And this is a line from John Lydon about his wife. Oddly enough, as bad as Alzheimer's is, there are great moments of tenderness between us. And I tried to capture that in the song. It's not all waiting for the Grim Reaper, which was the song he wrote about his wife's Alzheimer's. I can see her personality in her eyes. She lets me know that it's the communication skills that are letting her down. And I'm just blessed really that I can be there and catch on to that and maybe share that information as this progresses, as we know it will, to its ultimate sad demise, Johnny Lydon. So what he's saying is that despite the fact that she can't do what I am doing right now, which is expressing behaviors that let you see who Jason is, okay, a bit of me, but he can see it in her eyes. In other words, he has other ways of perceiving that Nora has a mind, such that he's actually able to see, but for the fact that she has verbal problems, in some sense, she's still there. And yet what's, of course, is interesting is if you met Nora Forster at that time, you would maybe not have the same impression of her as you look in her eyes. So the idea I'm getting at is this idea of lucidity in persons with advanced dementia. More formally, actually, this idea of paradoxical lucidity. And so a couple of years ago, I got invited by the National Institute of Aging to be part of a group to consider this concept of paradoxical lucidity, namely that in persons, and I'll give you a definition in the next slide of it, because it's one of the products of the group, as you see on this paper. here was what we produced. And in that paper, we proposed a definition. But the invitation I received was, we're forming a group that wants to look at paradoxical lucidity and try to come up with a roadmap to study it. And what paradoxical lucidity is in a person presumed to no longer be capable of being lucid, that they exhibit an episode of lucidity. And the reason why it's called paradoxical, therefore, is because when something's a paradox, what it means formally is that it defies a theory. So, for example, my theory says that you should not be lucid. If you show a lucid moment, I would say, well, that's just a paradoxical event. It doesn't fit with the theory. And all theories have paradoxical moments. No theory is perfect. And of course, though, sometimes a paradox is actually telling you that the theory you have is actually not correct. And the paradoxes are showing you flaws in your theory. So I showed up at this meeting kind of like as a physician practicing in the space. What was amazing is that I hadn't really thought about lucidity in advanced dementia. The few times I had heard about it, I just kind of dismissed it, if I even heard about it at all. And thought, well, I'll show up. I was there because I was the guy who was going to help with ethics, and they wanted me to help with research ethics issues, namely matters of consent and whatnot. And those were certainly issues. But the deeper that I got into that meeting, by the end of the day, I said, there's something really important going on here. Namely, that this is essential. Lucidity is getting at matters of mind perception in people with advanced dementia. And if someone does perceive lucid episodes, how would that impact the caregiving experience? And if they don't perceive lucid episodes, how does that impact the caregiving experience? So anyway, among the things that the group produced was this definition of paradoxical lucidity. And the definition written out here is episodes of unexpected, spontaneous, meaningful, and relevant communication or connectedness in a patient who is assumed to have permanently lost the capacity for coherent verbal or behavioral interaction due to a progressive and pathophysiological dementing process. It's a bit wordy. There's a lot packed in there. We've written a subsequent paper that sort of critiqued this conceptually. But I think the message is this individual does not really engage in any meaningful, coherent verbal or other behavioral interaction as a result of a brain disease. And yet, there's an episode of spontaneous, meaningful, and relevant communication or connectedness. That's a paradoxically lucid moment. And my hunch is many people who are in this room who are clinicians probably also, like myself, have a few anecdotal cases of hearing about lucid episodes and whatnot. So our group, so after this meeting, the NIA put out a call for research in this space, and our group responded with a project entitled Communication in Persons with Advanced Dementia. I'll explain to you why we didn't title the project to have anything to do with lucidity. And in a minute, next slide, I'll show you our aims and our fundamental hypothesis. But the basic goal of the project was to say, let's systematically go out and interview caregivers of persons with advanced dementia to find out whether they're witnessing episodes of lucidity. And if they are, what are their features and their characteristics descriptively? And number two, what, if anything, is the impact of lucid episodes on the caregiver's perception of the individual and their practices as a caregiver? And so we applied, got this grant funded by the NIA, and I'll going to run through the design and our top line results, and that's the remainder of my talk. So our first aim was a descriptive one, just simply to characterize lucidity as witnessed by family caregivers. And in a moment, I'll give you our definitions of family caregivers and the eligibility criteria for the patient. We wanted to examine how witnessing lucidity impacts beliefs about the minds of a person living with dementia, because a lucid episode is clearly an evidence of a person exhibiting mindfulness, of exhibiting mind. And we wanted to discover the clinical and ethical significance of witnessing an episode of lucidity. And our kind of organizing hypothesis or question that we had was that we felt that those who do witness a lucid episode will find it to be emotionally transformative. And we wanted to ask the question of, does witnessing a lucid episode in some way change care practices and the approach to caregiving? Do they, for example, want the person to receive different kinds of medical care, continue on certain pharmacotherapies, for example, because of the impact of that episode on the perception of the individual being there? So our approach to this was using methods of qualitative science. And the reason why we chose a qualitative approach is I can't go to the medical literature and find a scale, an assessment instrument that assesses for lucid episodes. There just isn't anything in the literature. It's at the stage of case reports, et cetera. Since we designed this project, there has been a paper published of a lengthy assessment tool for professionals, in other words, to ask someone working in residential long-term care. And so when there's no methods of measurement out there, scales or assessment instruments, to capture a phenomena, the best methods to approach that are qualitative methods. And so we developed an interview guide, conducted those interviews, recorded them, developed a code book, coded the interviews, and I'm going to give you the results of the taxonomy of lucid moments. So that's the overall schema of our project. To go into greater detail now about the interview. So, and I'll give you the eligibility criteria in a minute of who got in. So the interview's basic structure was, after recruitment into the project, a basic, it's all done telephonically, by the way, not Zoom, but telephone. We didn't want to have any of the visual issues. We just wanted to have a conversation. We asked a series of questions that assessed the caregiver's rating of the person's ability to perform IADLs, their caregiving experience with the individual, the kind of care they provide, et cetera. So a basic kind of clinical assessment of how severely the individual was disabled from their dementia and the role of the caregiver in providing that care. We had a series of questions that asked about mind perception. So meaning questions about the person's ability to experience the world, have joy, experience pleasure, experience pain, the person's ability to make decisions, express intentions, to capture the aspect of agency. So a series of open-ended questions to capture mind perception. I'll say this now and probably repeat it over the course of the interview. At no point in the interview, until a moment I'll tell you about in a moment, did we say to them words like mind or lucidity. In other words, the title of the project was Communication with Persons with Advanced Dementia. The consent form had the same title. The recruitment materials, the consent form, never talked about lucidity, never asked them, like, we want to ask you about episodes of unusual connectedness. It's a very deliberate design approach because we didn't want to feed people what our goal was. We didn't want to feed people a concept that they would then be primed to kind of tell us about. We wanted this to be as ground up as you will from our questions and their experiences. Next, after we asked the discussion to describe their relative's mind using questions that ask about experience and agency, we had a series of questions, and I'll show you the wording in a minute, that attempted to capture whether there have been lucid episodes in the individual. And I'll show you the wording of those questions in a minute. And then if they did volunteer that they were episodes that fit some of the criteria for lucidity, what the impact of those episodes were on the caregiving experience and the delivery of care. And then only then, at the very end of the interview, like, this is it, we're done, almost, was a question about a common expression that is used to describe dementia is that it causes a person to lose their mind. In light of what we've been talking about, I'd like to know what you think about that. And then they answered that, and then the interview wrapped. And so that was the only time when we got to explicitly ask people the mind question. I will not give you the results of that question 6 now, but I'll simply say, I think that, I'll spoiler a bit, in light of the data that I will show you, I think you will find, as I've found by looking at the data so far, that the answers to question 6 were quite interesting. So let me tell you more about who got into the study based on eligibility criteria and just some of the flow of recruitment. So the subjects of the study were caregivers of persons diagnosed with dementia recruited from our Penn Memory Center. The Memory Center has a pretty decent database that records anyone that's seen their basic demographic information, their diagnosis, and select measures of cognitive and functional impairment that are updated. And so what we were able to do was query the database for individuals with the diagnosis of a neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's or related other cause of dementia. And we had in the database data on their overall cognition as measured by the Mini-Mental, and also an overall functional measure called the FRS, or Functional Rating Scale, which one of its subscales is a measure of speech and language. And so to be eligible, you had to have a diagnosis, you had to have a mini mental of 11 or less, and an FRS speech score greater than 4. That, the text on what 4 describes that the caregiver selects is something like profound impairments in communication, rarely speaks in full sentences, only occasional words. So we then recruited the caregiver of that individual as identified in our database, and attempted to capture caregivers who were spousal versus non-spousal, caregivers for whom the person lived in the community versus in residential long-term care, and tried also to balance on whether the person was still alive or not. And the interview, by the way, asked them to look back over the last 4 months of the person's cognitive and functional abilities, mind, and episodes of lucidity. You can see the recruitment flow here, and I think the key point of the flow is that of the 59 people we contacted, we couldn't reach 14 and 11 declined. So a good 25 people just either said no or we couldn't get them. And I'm often wondering how much, if we had interviewed them, the results I'm going to show you would be different, because perhaps the reason why they declined and we're not going to reach is because of a completely different caregiving experience than the one that we found with respect to matters related to mind perception and lucidity. So ultimately, we enrolled 33 caregivers, although 3 were excluded because after enrollment, 1 decided not to do it, 1 could never be reached, and 1 bailed out of the interview halfway through and said, I don't want to do this anymore. So in the end, we had 30 caregivers who completed an interview. And in one case, it actually ended up being 2 caregivers talking about one individual, a daughter of the patient, and the granddaughter of that patient hopped on the call and decided they wanted to do the interview together. So that's who we studied. A bit about the caregivers, without going into gross detail, it's a qualitative study. So, the sample is what it is, that with respect to size and representativeness. From our perspective, by the time we hit about 30 people, in terms of analysis, things were getting pretty redundant. Majority were women and white by self-identified race, ethnicity. The age range reflects adult children versus spouses. Majority are retired. I think a key thing here is that, excuse my sort of leaning in, but it's on the next slide where, so many of them, the majority have been caring for the individual for at least 5 years, and the majority identified as a primary caregiver. The majority were spouses of the individual, and about a quarter were adult children. So that was the sample. And then for the persons living with dementia, obviously an older group, given the nature of the disease, 62 to 92 years of age. And essentially, the descriptors from the interview, they were fully dependent on IADLs and most BADLs, and I think with the exception for some of being able to walk around and to eat by hand feeding or feeding themselves. So a disabled group, to be sure, and the descriptors they gave us of their communication abilities endorsed generally what the FRS scale was I can get some words out of them, and sometimes he talks. Oftentimes it doesn't make much sense consistently, or the flow of things is really difficult to follow. Others reported they're relatively rarely spoke at all. So a fairly impaired group of patients being cared for by family caregivers, most of them in the community, a few dead, a few in residential long-term care, most of them spouses. Okay, so let me tell you the results we got. So first, I did promise you, and here it is, the question on how we assess lucidity. So we've made it to the last section of the interview. Now I want to ask, as you think back over the last several months, have you ever noticed a time when he unexpectedly started interacting with others, interacting in a way that was out of the ordinary for him, different from the ways you've described him to me? Now, remember, this question has come after lengthy set of questions about the person's ability to communicate, perform daily activities. So this isn't an out of the blue question. And if the answer was no, or something not terribly clear, you see the series of probes that were used to follow afterwards. And so this was how we assess lucidity. And again, as I pointed out, we didn't say to them, has there ever been a time when your relative's been lucid, for example? We just let them, we went with this definition. Or this non-definition, this sort of question, if you will. I will volunteer now, I think I repeated again in a subsequent slide, is that many individuals, we haven't quantified, I don't think I have the numbers on the slides here, already before had volunteered a lucid episode. We didn't probe it at that point. But when you ask them about communication, they would say, well, you know, there are some times when it's really unusual. Like all of a sudden and then they would go on and describe what essentially was an episode of unexpected communication and connectedness. And we would just park that away. And many of them would then re-volunteer it here. Some of them would not re-volunteer it. And they might even say no. And then we would say, well, what about that? And, oh, yeah, you're right, et cetera. And so we did find it interesting that people volunteered lucid episodes even before we asked about lucid episodes with this question. So in total, 34 episodes of what we would call lucidity were identified. 25 participants gave accounts of at least one specific moment. Of that, 17 described just one, 7 described 2, and 1 described up to 3 episodes. And in a small number of cases, 10 episodes were described as behaviors that periodically recurred. Most of these behaviors that people describe to us, and I'll give you their features and whatnot later, were oftentimes just a few seconds. Words like a blip, a fleeting moment, etc. But some episodes lasted for more than a few minutes. And in one case, it was an episode of about 45 minutes of duration that they reported. So 30 caregivers of that, 25 gave detailed accounts of at least one specific moment of clarity, one specific moment of what we would call lucidity. Now, that meant there were some caregivers who did not give us lucid episodes. And so let me tell you a bit about them. They gave us episodes, but they wouldn't endorse them as unexpected or unusual. They didn't judge it that way. So like they would say, well, she does do this, but I don't think it's that unexpected. So sometimes my wife is more connected in social settings and other times seems to comprehend what was happening on TV shows, said this husband. Yet he said, it's not like it's a light switch on because he felt it was kind of fit with her as a kind of constant. And so in his view, I don't think you would say that I'm paradoxically lucid. I think, for example, you would say that I am lucid. The guy's been lucid all day. Thank you. So that's his point was that, yeah, she sometimes is more connected, but it's not much more than what she is. And so I can't really call it you see what I'm getting at. Another was a daughter who talked about her mother with moments of unusual clarity. And she said she'll answer a full sentence and we'll look at each other, meaning her and her siblings, and we'll say, she just said a whole sentence. But then she went on to say, well, but those things happen a fair amount of time. They're consistent. And so again, I think we would argue that they're reporting lucid episodes, but because they felt that they weren't terribly different than what the person did, they weren't going to consider them as unexpected and unusual. And I think they were sort of holding back on that idea. So I'm not going to count these as lucid episodes, but I think what I would say is that what they're describing is this person is lucid. We didn't find anyone who said, no, absolutely nothing, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so what were the behaviors so they said, yes, there's been a moment. All right, well, tell me what it was. And so the next 2 slides, I'm going to talk to you about what these, quote, unusual behaviors were, and give you a little bit more detail. And then the subsequent slides, what I'm going to do is tell you more about the mental capacities that they ascribe to the behavior. So that's the next bits that I'm going to have for you. So a great number of them were utterances, verbal utterances that the person made. Quite a number of them were utterances that were considered appropriate to the context. And I'll give you examples of what those were later when I talk about some of the mental features ascribed to them. But things like accurate usage of a person's proper name or clear attention to the physical surroundings around them in terms of things that they said about the world around them. Sometimes the production was of unusually sophisticated language compared to their abilities, typically in terms of the words that they said, multiple complete sentences as opposed to single phrases. A few people felt that episodes of language, even if it was gibberish, was unusually connected and whatnot, because they felt that the tone and the way that the words were coming out expressed a degree of connectedness, that there was something behind what was being said, even though what was said was lexically, semantically gibberish. 2 people reported singing as particularly in company with other people, as an episode of unusually connected behavior. The nonverbal behaviors were also reported. Some people reported not verbal but nonverbal behaviors, facial expressions, a smile. Remember Johnny Liddon's, I can see it in her eyes, so eye contact, which was again interpreted as unusually meaningful. Physical gestures, clearly pointing to something in a way that showed clear intention, attention to the object, that is to say perception, and intention in terms of indicating that. And one individual danced in a way that was unusual given the, well, again, this is what they volunteered to us as unusual communication and connectedness. So those are the behaviors, verbal and nonverbal behaviors. Now, the next 3 slides or so, what I'm going to do is tell you about the mental capacities that they ascribe to these behaviors. And that'll get us a little deeper into some of the specifics of some of these various behaviors. So one mental capacity that was then ascribed to behaviors that people reported was the recognition of specific people or animals. And so, for example, one of those was a daughter who's lived with her mother in a house, and the house had other family members. And one day, the patient, I'm a doctor, so I tend to call people patients, is in the house and walks into the room, and there's a niece there who's typically not in the house, hasn't been actually there for a while. And the patient says to the niece, "Oh, hi, Nellie, how are you doing? Or what are you doing here today?" And that was it. But for the caregiver, the daughter, this recognition of the niece was unusual because she said, "What are you doing here today?" And she went on to explain that the niece doesn't normally live in the house and she's not normally there. And she also called the niece by a nickname that very few people use. And in fact, only the mother uses that nickname, no one else except mom. And so in summary, the daughter concluded, these are just shades of her old self. I would have thought that that was her many years ago. In other words, mother had not really recognized family members and confused them, but all of a sudden now she recognized a family member who she hasn't seen in a while, using a nickname that no one else uses. And with also emotional recognition. How are you doing? Like, oh, like I haven't seen you. And so, oh, hi, how are you doing? So that also was part of the sort of depth of why this was clear and connected, not just the words, but the emotion behind the words. Another example was another mental capacity was that the person's behavior showed an increased awareness of their surroundings. And so this was the son who lived again with his father with advanced dementia. And the son, they lived in a house with stairs and a banister type arrangement. And the son at one point leaned over the banister in a way that if he continued to lean, he would have fallen down fallen flights of stairs. And the father says, "Be careful." And until the caregiver is out of harm's way. And then it's after that actually kind of goes back to being his kind of passive, unconcerned self. So according to the son, the father's awareness of the surrounding environment returned when the son was in this dangerous situation. That type of situation where harm will come to me, it just comes back, it being the father's concern. I don't know where it comes from, but it comes back and he starts engaging right away. That if I'm away from it, then it subsides. He won't continue on with the conversation after that. So it's sort of like, in fact, the son would sometimes actually provoke his father by putting himself in dangerous situations. So his father would sort of, watch out, and it was his way of testing and seeing if his father was still there, because the father would be concerned that the son might fall down the stairs. Another mental capacity was evidence that the behavior showed evidence of the person's ability to understand others' emotions and intentions. So this case is a husband and wife at the kitchen table where the American family gathers and conducts most of its business. outside of the bedroom. And sorry. And the husband is sitting at the kitchen table, and he has all this medical paperwork related to, as only in America, the various bills that are not bills and all the other forms that come out when you like just go to get your, your skin check or something, And he actually starts like fretting over this, like, oh my God, this is so confusing, and it's going to take a while to sort this mess out, and I don't know what we're going to do here, whatever. And his wife says, don't worry, you're smart, you'll figure it out. And this husband says that for him, she suddenly showed sensitivity to his distress. And he equated it to occasional episodes when they're FaceTiming with their daughter, and the daughter who was pregnant at the time, and the wife, the mother of the daughter, would ask how the pregnancy is going. And his point was, in this moment, there's empathy, there's concern. She was concerned about me and my distress over the bills. She'll be on FaceTime and be concerned about and ask my daughter how she's doing with her pregnancy, which, remember, this woman is profoundly amnestic, and the pregnancy is no more than 9 months old. So this mother, the patient, has learned and encoded and feeling, when she at least learns it in real time, there's pregnancy, this is my daughter, how's it going? Because I think most women know that a pregnancy can be pretty darn rough. I appreciate the fullness that she made a connection, that she somehow was outside of herself and was thinking about someone else, that it was me, which was nice. For that moment, her world just got a little larger. It didn't get smaller. Now, what's interesting about this gentleman in particular is his wife also would look at her reflection in the side view mirror of the passenger mirror of the car, and would occasionally engage in elaborate conversations with her reflection, elaborate, like, back and forth. And we asked him, well, what about when she talks to the reflection? And he dismissed that as that's just the disease and the problems patients have with perception. And his point was, because there wasn't, while it was lexically complex, syntactically, semantically complex verbiage that she was engaging in with a reflection, it wasn't of any meaningful connection. It was talking with her reflection as though it was another individual. And for him, that was just the tragedy of the disease. Another was a patient whose husband reported how his wife was able to form and pursue a goal. So this is a husband and wife who were on a Zoom-based activity for caregivers and patients. And it was an art event that they were doing. So on Zoom, everyone's making a painting, and then they would hold it up to the camera to show your painting. And the project was a painting that they were doing was something abstract. They weren't given a representational activity like everyone paint this flower. And so the other group members are sort of embellishing their paintings and kind of over painting. And this patient, sort of with her husband, as they're doing this, kind of pronounces her painting is finished. And she's not going to continue to work on it. And the caregiver felt that this showed that she was suddenly wise to the moment, that she was demonstrating unusual insight into her creation and a strong intention for how it should look and what it should represent. So it goes on. Other people were embellishing their paintings, doing all kinds of things. They were kind of destroying the purity of that central idea, which is random visual things can sometimes make scenes. And so she saw that one was very simple. The rest of the project, she refused to continue with the project. She refused to mess with it. She took the first thing, put the paint, the pigment in the water, the image, and she wouldn't touch it. She wouldn't change it. Everyone else was piling on glitter and gooey things. And she leaned over to me and she said, mine's better. And so for him, I mean, and what I find particularly interesting about this is sort of artistic engagement. In other words, she's creating a piece of art, she's judging it, she's seeing other people's works of art, and she's interpreted the meaning and connection with her art, and has decided mine's better. Like, I have completed my work of art. Now, actually, I know this. Many of these patients I know, and I know this patient, and like all the others, I mean, when I heard the story, I'm like, wow, because this is not what I would have expected from her, given the patient I saw in my practice. So some of the literature on lucidity has been called terminal lucidity, that it only occurs, and it occurs proximal to death, that it's this herald to death. And 8 interviews with the caregivers of people who were deceased. So 8 caregivers were people who their relative had deceased. and all reported witnessing at least one episode. But in general, they were not precisely specific to death. 4 of the episodes reported to occur at least several months. And for episodes that were observed closer to death, you can see the timing. So we didn't find a strong finding, albeit with only 8 people, of terminal lucidity. In other words, amongst these groups, we didn't find that in the day before death or the hours before death, the person suddenly became lucid. I'm not rejecting the idea of terminal lucidity, but I think what our data show, we didn't do a follow-up interviews with the other 22 people who at the time the relatives were alive. But again, we asked people to look back 4 months, but the idea that lucidity is a herald of death in people with advanced dementia may be the case, but wasn't necessarily the case amongst the people we studied. So we wanted to find out, what did they think caused the person to develop a lucid episode? And generally, caregivers emphasized they didn't know. What's she been doing? Did she have her medicine? Didn't she have it? I tried to analyze it and come up with something. I didn't come up with anything. In other words, they wanted to try and figure out what just caused that. But in general, we're sort of left, I don't know. But those who did think that there was a causal mechanism, they generally featured the environment and other aspects of the world around the patient, the time of day, whether they'd exercised that day, whether they had a good night's sleep. Some ascribed it to spontaneous brain activity. But in general, people were struggling to figure out what just caused that. So that's now I'm going to pivot to talk about the impact of witnessing lucidity on care, and then some concluding points. But I think already, I don't want to jump to conclusions, so let me go to the impact on care. So we did not find, and we asked this explicitly, that episode that they reported did not result in caregivers doing things to change the care the person received as medical care. In other words, we didn't find people saying, I went to the doctor and asked about, is there a medication I should be giving them? Or, I want medical interventions done, et cetera. No one changed the overall plan of medical care. And none volunteered. In fact, many were very open that they felt this was just an event along the long, slow decline of dementia. In other words, it didn't even change their view of the prognosis of the disease. Most didn't talk about it with the doctor. They weren't sure what to say or doubted whether the doctor would ever care. What was found was that caregivers very much told us that the episode validated their perceptions of the person as still a person, and so it affected their approach to daily care. For example, it reinforced the need to do things, social events, activities. It reinforced the need to attend to diet, to try and create a sleep schedule. And some told us how they would experiment with things to try and induce further episodes, but most reported that those experiments were to naught. And so in some sense, what you had was an example of the impact, not so much on medical ethics, but everyday ethics. Namely, it affected and reinforced the caregiving role, as opposed to the medical care role. So how did caregivers react to these? Most caregivers' immediate emotional reaction fit into one of 4 categories. The dominant one was positive. They generally reported that they felt happiness, it was moved, positive, joy. A few reported negative reactions of jealousy or sadness. Why did she do it when they walked in the room and not every single time when I walk in the room, for example? A few reported mixed emotions. It was super funny, but also very sad. And some gave us an emotional valence that it was indeterminate. Well, I was flabbergasted. I found it interesting. It was bizarre. Over the long term, though, after that immediate, that's how I felt after I witnessed it, most ultimately reported how it settled down into a complex tangle of emotions because of the unsuccessful efforts to recreate it, because of the recognition for most that this didn't really change their perception of the prognosis of the disease. It was a blip amidst a long downhill decline, a long downhill slide. So in the end, it leveled out into kind of a mixed, kind of pleasant pain sort of experience about what it was like to witness a lucid episode. All right, let me talk about a couple discussion points. So I think what we found was that depending on how you ask things, sometimes you may get different answers. Remember, we didn't go into the study saying we want to talk to you about lucid episodes. We didn't talk about lucidity um, using some overarching prompt. And we never used the word lucidity. And so lucidity emerged in a more organic way throughout the interview, or until we finally asked about episodes of unexpected communication. I think what this highlights is the risk of using a single definition to collect reports of lucid episodes, especially in a survey, because things are so nuanced, et cetera, that if you have a definition you give people and ask them, have you witnessed this, you may miss the varieties of the ways people perceive something as lucidity. It would suggest that there's a need for an assessment instrument, so much more so than a single like scale, if you will, to try and measure lucidity. You can do that, but you may lose information. The second point I want to bring up is paradoxical lucidity truly paradoxical? Remember, I told you something is a paradox because it doesn't fit a theory. But our results suggest that lucid episodes may be infrequent within individuals, but across the group, they're actually quite frequent. And this actually backs up with other studies, some surveys, as well as similar qualitative studies of selected samples, where in general you find that lucidity is more the norm than the exception. Depending on how it's asked about, the way the interviews are conducted, you see a consistent finding that it's 60 to 100%, if you will, across the studies. And so this really leads you to question whether it's truly appropriate to call lucidity paradoxical lucidity. And so this would suggest that we might want to think about dropping the paradoxical around lucidity and simply accepting that lucidity is a phenomena seen throughout the course of dementia. It's variable in its manifestations, but the idea that someone, quote, becomes non-lucid with the disease doesn't fit with the experience of the disease, or at least needs to be more precisely defined about what that stage of disease is, which I think would be quite difficult to do. So more deeply about what we mean when we say lucidity, the definition of lucidity I showed you from the NIA report emphasizes the return of linguistic abilities. But remember, our people didn't just talk about verbal abilities, they talked about nonverbal behaviors. In addition, coherence wasn't so much the feature of the verbal abilities. It was more about relevance, excuse me. It was more about, coherence wasn't the feature. It was more about the relevance of it. Meaning the guy whose wife looks in the mirror and starts talking, he dismissed that. What mattered to him was the relevance of what she said to him, their relationship, who he knows her as a person. My old girl was back. And the majority of unexpected verbal behaviors were identified as unexpected because of these pragmatic reasons of the connectedness that they felt, of the relevance of the behavior, as opposed to rich, verbally complex, grammatically complex sentences. It was that eye contact, that Nellie, it's you, with the eyebrows raised, or another case, a caregiver who told a joke that was just classic for the kind of joke she used to crack. A short joke? You mean it's my boyfriend, she said with an arched eyebrow to her daughter's boyfriend, to her daughter about a boyfriend. But it totally was connected to the moment. It's her boyfriend. I'm going to crack a joke that's my boyfriend. And I'm going to use that famous arched eyebrow I use when I crack one of my ironic jokes. And for the daughter, that was just mom, classic mom. You mean my boyfriend, 4 or 5 words. I think our data suggests, and other studies back this up, that witnessing lucidity affects caregivers and caregiving. There's clearly an emotional valence. In the immediate time, it's positive. It's ultimately interpreted as part of the sort of disease experience and contributing to a complex tangle of emotions: jubilation, motivation, frustration, and resignation. It reaffirms their role as caregiving. It's unfortunate, though, that they don't routinely discuss it with medical professionals. They don't think we have much to say about it. They don't think there's much that we care about it. The few who did said the doctor was generally sort of dismissive of it. Brain blips, just that's what happens. But again, it affected their approach to care. It reinforced what they were doing. It reinforced the role of being a caregiver. In my own clinical practice, I can say that I include asking about lucidity, particularly in people with advanced disease. Is there ever a moment where your relative exhibits unexpected communication or connectedness? And they will volunteer it. They'll say, yeah, no, there's times when she looks at me and I'm like, wow, she's there. And I'll probe it. What is that like for you? And they'll say, well, it's really creepy, and they want to talk about that. I'll follow it up. I'll say, well, what do you think it's like to be Joe or whatnot? I'll use the first name because they get it. Like, people know each other. And they'll follow on. They'll say, well, it must be pretty scary. It's a very common expression I've heard now from caregivers who witness lucidity, that for the person it must be scary because I worry that inside she's aware but not aware. The times when she's not lucid, I wonder what's going on. And I've had, and I'm not saying this is but I've had caregivers burst into tears after that. And I'm saying that to you not because, isn't that fun to make them cry? But what I'm getting at, I think, is that for them, this really gets at the heart of what it is like to be a caregiver and what it is like to try and perceive what it is like to be a person with advanced dementia and the intense suffering the caregivers experience as they're doing this work. And, you can say, well, what's the therapeutic value of that, Jason? It's just for you to try to get someone to cry in your clinic. And I'm not sure, but I do think it allows me to know that I'm acknowledging that you still see mom in there, even though anyone that meets her casual would be like, and you can think of all the awful terms that people use. She's just a walkie-talkie. She's gorked out. I mean, we can run the list of the language that some of us have used in our own clinical practices. And I think it's one of the reasons why for caregivers, encounters with us, the medical system can be so awful because of the ways we perceive the person around them that they're caring for. So the study has clear limitations. That refusal rate bugs me. I wonder the folks who said no or were unreachable, would they describe very different experiences? It's quite possible. The sample is homogeneous along a number of axes: race, education, mostly spousal caregivers, very few who were deceased. Certainly, this was not about going forward. Let me come back and ask you, what's happening in real time, but looking back over 4 months. Those limitations recognized when this is embedded in the literature of the few other studies in the space, the findings are consistent with respect to at least that lucidity happens, that it's meaningful, that it's a variety of behaviors that are both verbal and nonverbal behaviors. So, losing a million minds, losing my mind, it's interesting, despite that initial way of framing the problem by the federal government in 1987, it's never been framed that way since in reports and whatnot. If you go to the NAPA website, the National Alzheimer's Project website, they don't talk about mind there at all. If you search on the word mind, you don't find any mention of mind. And yet that's what matters. DiBaggio's book is just one example of this. And what's interesting in my own practice is I never was taught or thought about, when I saw patients, their mind. I thought about their cognition, language, visuospatial function, orientation, executive function. I thought about their mood, anxiety, apathy, depression. I thought about their function. I'm a geriatrician, especially IADLs, BADLs. I thought about their gait. I thought about falls. I thought about incontinence. I thought about trouble swallowing. But I never, ever, ever thought to put it all together and just say, well, what is it like to be Thomas? Which is a standard question in my perception. Both asking Thomas that, because he would probably say, well, I feel like I'm losing my mind. That's what he said. Or Thomas's caregiver, because that is in the end what puts it together. So I'll just wrap up with a couple sort of broader points. I've talked about mind, and I mentioned, mind has been conceptualized along 2 axes: experience, which one would also call consciousness, conscious experience, the ability to feel the world, have empathy, sadness, joy, anger, and agency, the ability to express intentions or beliefs. And by intention and belief, I mean things like, it is sunny outside. Why do I think that? Well, because I see glowing in the windows. I know it's daytime, so I think it's sunny. Okay. Or I am hungry, I will get food. And so this is a very interesting study that was done where some 2,000 adults were surveyed, and they were asked questions about each of these creatures and things along the side here. And so I'll do the fourth wall breakage here. Just how do I turn this on here? Maybe I can't. Well, of course I can, but I can't. It can be done. Well, anyway. Well, here we go. All right. So what
the creatures here are, some of them are human type, or are living creatures, a baby, a chimp, a dog, a fetus, a frog, and some are human and some are not, like a frog, a chimp, a dog, and then some are non-living creatures like a robot, a dead person, a dead woman, and then there's God. And so what they would do is give people pairings, like comparing a baby to a robot, which is more likely to feel pain. Comparing a chimp to a girl, which is more likely to be able to express a desire, which is more likely to feel guilt, etc. And so people did these ratings, and you can then take the ratings, subject them to factor analysis, and for each of these creatures, objects, place them along the axes of the two that emerge from the data, which is experience and agency. And so what they, so went the wrong way. So just, no surprise, an adult man, an adult woman, and you, the respondent, all were generally rated as having high experience and high agency. I think, many of us know that makes sense. I'd probably put myself up there too. And no surprise, the robot was given some agency. They're pretty creepy robots. They can express beliefs, they can make intentions. Hey Siri, what's the weather, right? But I don't think Siri feels the weather is hot. Siri could say it's hot because Siri can say, well, 80 must be hot. But I don't think Siri feels that it's hot outside. The dead person is interesting, and many people have looked at how people ascribe mind to cadavers. Certainly, if you look at the Pieta, the statue by Michelangelo in the Vatican, I would argue Mary's behavior with the body of her son suggests that she still has some sense of his mind being there, perhaps. But it's the rest of these objects that become really interesting. Here's your family dog. Here's a baby. Here's the girl. Here's the chimp. Degrees of agency and high in experience. Here's a frog. Here's the fetus. Here's a man in PVS. And there's God. God's got a lot of agency. But interestingly, these people didn't really have a sense of the Christian God that suffered on the cross, bear with me, where you would think they would have them high on agency. Like the whole idea of Jesus was he was just like us. Again, I'm not practicing theology here, but if they listened to their theology, he was supposed to be up here, whatever. Anyway, that's not the issue. All right, I kind of wonder where you would put people with advanced dementia. In my class that I teach, I have them do this exercise, but I include cards I get rid of I use Alexa here, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. And I give them descriptions of people with mild, moderate, severe dementia and have them put them along this axis. And it's a fascinating exercise. I have them do it on their own, and then I have them look at each other's exercise and go back and do it again to see how well Biv and how other people answered. Where will I put people? And they struggle. So what do they say about the famous comment I had about Alexa was, Alexa has all agency and no experience until you own it for a year, and then it gets more experience, which I thought was utterly fascinating. Now, how would witnessing episodes of lucidity impact on where you put someone, I think is very interesting. So in other words, the woman who would talk in the mirror, I guess maybe somewhere sort of here, and then all of a sudden, don't worry, you're smart, you'll figure it out, kind of moving up here, right? I think that's what's going on here for caregivers, I think, which is our next project, which is what we want to do is look at how witnessing dementia influences mind perception. So we have that question about loss of mind, we have that question about mind perception earlier. And what we want to do is look at how in individuals who have perceived lucidity, they react to the idea of dementia as causing a loss of mind, and also how they perceive the mind in the individual. So thank you. That's the end of my formal remarks. There's a little bit of time for questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present these data. So thank you very much.
So much for that terrific talk.
Oh.
As a thank you for being one of our visiting professors,
Well,
we
thank
actually
you.
have a plaque that says "A teacher affects eternity." and all the influence
Wow.
that you have, you never know where it ends.
Well,
So,
thank you so much.
so
That means a lot to me. Yeah.
and
Thank
then
you.
I'll open it up for questions. Maybe I'll take the prerogative and ask the first one.
Yeah.
You mentioned that maybe this isn't a paradox, because I have to say, a lot of my patients with dementia, their caregivers will say they have good days and bad days.
Right.
Do you think lucidity kind of plays into, like, that's how they describe a good day or a bad day, or did anyone kind of link those?
They didn't, because we did pick a group that were so impaired that these were rare. But you're right. If we had gone more milder, I think we would have seen people begin to talk about the quote good days and bad days. And I do think in people with synuclein pathology, Lewy body presentations, these kind of findings would be especially pronounced, because they clearly have these quote good days and bad days. And one of the follow-up projects we're thinking about doing is interviewing more caregivers of more mild stage patients, not so much about paradoxical lucidity, but just about mind perception in general. Yeah.
Great. So interesting. Other questions?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, so thanks. That was really fascinating. So, Jason, I was wondering, do you think, I'm interested about the characteristics of the caregiver that introduced this. I mean, I guess with this sort of two parts, do you think that I'm wondering if there's more like of these lucidity episodes that are happening, but the caregiver has to be in the right space to see them and recognize them. And like, did you sort of see any characteristics of caregivers that seem to, for lack of a better term, bring this out? I mean, was this like, when you're talking to these caregivers, you say this is sort of a cross-section of caregivers, or there's something special about it? Like,
Since everyone reported a lucid episode, even the 4 that didn't think it was lucid by the criteria of unexpected, because she's quote, it's usually there's no variance to speak like a quantitative person. So I couldn't tease out any characteristics of those caregivers. Again, there's those 11 who refused and 14 that were not contacted, or vice versa. And maybe they would be the crowd that say, no, there's nothing going on there. And then who would they be and why? So I think the answer right now is I have no ability to talk about differences in caregiving amongst caregivers who quote witnessed versus not. I would emphasize that many of the episodes, had they been witnessed by you or me, would not have been perceived as unexpected communication, because it was so contextual. It was so driven by the nature of the individual and the relationship, et cetera. What's interesting, of course, is that episodes that for us might seem very lucid, the caregiver might seem not lucid, because, for example, I'm going to make up one, because someone who says, so I walk in the room and she turns to my son and says, "Happy birthday, it's so good to see you." Well, that's syntactically complex. And for many of these patients would be like, whoa, I haven't heard a sentence like that in a couple of months. But it's not his birthday. And I think many of them would have dismissed that as, well, there it goes again, out of touch with reality, and yet verbally complex, et cetera. So it was about the connectedness, et cetera, that mattered a lot. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was pretty struck by how many examples were concepts in novel situation, really being calm, or sun standing on the edge of the ledge, or being in a car, seeing reflection in the window. Is that something that you noticed? I think it's a lot of new experiences generated.
Yeah, I can't say that teased out, but I could be. I'd want to look more on that. It was interesting, though, the way the caregivers interpreted what the impact of was the need to keep on doing sustaining activities. In other words, it's not just about, making sure they get 3 meals a day and, clothes change, but it's about creating this kind of stimulating environment that engages the person. One caregiver, sister of the patient, very much reinforced that idea. And, she actually went on to say, they say how this disease, like, it makes you become like a child again. And she says, it's not all like that. And it was these kind of episodes that had her reject this idea of like a child, because, of course, those were behaviors that were not at all like a child in terms of the degree of adult-like, if I may. I'm sorry, I popped off the slides. I just want to, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think, what she was saying is, when I see my sister be so lucid, you know, she's up there with me and adults as opposed to quote, like a child. And that's very much, I mean, I understand now why this sort of rhetoric of second childhood like a child is so profoundly wrong, even though, yes, they have, if you test them cognitively, they test out, quote, like a child, their executive function. I remember a physician saying, I mean, this executive function is like an 8-year-old, and he was right. But executive function is not mind. It's an aspect of what would make a mind. And so I think for many caregivers, yeah, I'll stop. Yeah. Yeah, hey, from the chat.
One is around sort of visual thinking. Are there any concerns in the episodes of lucidity or perceptions of caregivers who wanted to see such episodes?
Sure.
When they love, we lost their mind, and perhaps is not truly a lucid moment, but perception.
I agree. I mean, it very well could be, you know, and it absolutely, you know, and so this is where people who do work in what are called the neural correlates of consciousness step in, and they say, you know, I have ways of measuring actual neural behavior that I think correlate with consciousness, and I'll let you know that. And there's a whole emerging field now of using the science of neural correlates of consciousness now in persons with dementia to see, are they actually showing neural evidence of consciousness? So you can do that with people in what we call poorly now persistent vegetative states. You can do fMRI work that gives them emotional stimuli, and you can show or not show that they're engaging in conscious activity. And that's done in people with PVS, and you find that as a proportion of them have conscious activity that is that like if they weren't in PVS. So that's you know, the answer. I don't know if it is the answer to that question would be, well, at the time when these episodes occur, are they showing evidence of the neural correlates that would suggest that was conscious activity versus not? Yeah.
The last question was about whether this sort of lucidity demonstrates any cognitive reserve. So could you comment on to what extent episodes of lucidity, especially the more dramatic or sustained ones, might suggest an otherwise unrecognized cognitive reserve if it's somehow medical intervention can be tapped in a more consistent way?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, do episodes of lucidity, back to the Zoom crowd, or maybe it's in the chat so they can all read it? Yeah.
Actually, they can't read it.
Yeah. So the question was, does the fact that lucid episodes occur suggest that there is circuitry cognitive reserve that could it be tapped into, otherwise would allow more lucidity to occur, improvement? And I mean, that's the provocative question that surrounds all this. Like, if this can happen, then there must be neural networks that allow it to happen. And so therefore, if we could tap into those neural networks, would we be able to restore cognitive abilities? And that is a very provocative question that I think, let me cite it with this. The talk I'm going to give, if you're all invited to, I guess, via Zoom, or come down to the, wherever the MAC is in the Memory and Aging Center is Mission Bay. I'm going to talk about a case of an individual who had a profound loss of mind. I mean, dramatic, became, quote, really demented. But then an intervention was taken and the really demented reverted. And so what I'm getting at is, I think of these lucid episodes as examples of the mind of a person with dementia is incredibly scaffolded into the world around them. And I think these lucid episodes are part of a general sort of case study of, depending on the environment, the world that's created for that mind, it functions more or less. It's more or less perceivable. But having said that, of course, I think many would desire, what's the drug or the neural circuitry intervention or the TMS mechanism, you know, magnetic stimulation, that could be done to bring these episodes out. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, just a quick method question. So for the subjective qualitative part of it, why 4 months?
So the question was, why 4-month look back? Granted, some people probably gave us something that was more like 5 or 6, but 1 month seemed too short, 6 was too much, 4 seemed just right. It was a Goldilocks, and I'm not saying we got the soup just right, but it was an effort to try to keep them grounded in some reasonable amount of time. Also, we didn't want them looking back on episodes when the person was really not where they are now. In other words, we went, okay, given where they are now, have you witnessed an episode of unexpected, as opposed to someone saying, well, yeah, 3 years ago, she was totally, would be great. Well, I want to know how things are now. So 4 months gave us a sort of reasonable window of time to capture something while the person is still sort of when the person was like they are, what you're telling them are now. So that was the balance. Yeah. Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the opportunity to present the data. There'll be more to come.